Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Simon Elliott. I'm the Deputy Director at the Queensland Art Gallery, and I'd like to welcome you all to Perspective Asia, tonight's talk, What Happened in Wuhan. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet here in Brisbane, and acknowledge the First Nations people as this country's first creative artists and storytellers, and acknowledge the massive contribution that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make to the art of this country. And I'd also like to extend that to all First Nations people joining us this evening. Perspective Asia series is a program of public seminars designed and promoted by the Griffith Asia Institute of Griffith University, combined with the Australian Centre of Asia Pacific Art at the Queensland Art Gallery. It sets out to explore issues of contemporary culture, politics and society in our region, while fostering public discussion of Australia's relation with the Asia Pacific region. Our guest speakers in this series provide insights into the development of new discourses, practices and perspectives for dealing with the changing conditions and issues that are faced in the countries around us. This lecture series has been traditionally hosted at the Gallery of Modern Art in Brisbane, and while we were thrilled to return to the physical events earlier this year, we found ourselves rather quickly pivoting once again to be online. And a big thanks to Professor Caitlin Byrne, Director of Griffith Asia Institute, Megan and the Griffith Asia Institute team for very quickly adapting tonight's lecture to be online. And we very much look forward to welcoming Chris to the gallery today, but hopefully this will happen when the lockdown lifts around the country. So tonight's speaker, Chris Buckley, thank you so much for joining us. Just to give an intro to Chris. Chris is a chief China correspondent for the New York Times and is now working from Sydney after being forced to leave China in May. Before then, he spent much of the past 24 years in China as a reporter for Reuters and for the New York Times. He's written widely about Chinese politics and social change and stayed in Wuhan from the day that the government locked down that city in January last year. In recent years, he has also reported extensively on the crackdown in Xinjiang. He has been among the New York Times journalists whose work has won a Pulitzer Prize for public service this year. Tonight's lecture couldn't be more topical. What happened in Wuhan? It will reflect on China's pandemic crisis from the early outbreak to the end of the world's first COVID lockdown. An overview of China's response from a journalist who spent 2.5 months in Wuhan during that lockdown. Q&A function enabled and moderated by Griffith Asia Institute's Professor Caitlin Byrne. Audience can contribute to the Q&A by sharing questions via the Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of the screen. Questions can be submitted at any time during the event. This presentation we have been hugely excited about, a moment to reflect on the time and place that such a profound influence and indeed entered the global consciousness in such an unprecedented way over the past 2 years. I'm sure you are all looking forward to it as much as I am, and thank you once again, and Chris, for generously participating online tonight from Sydney. We're very much looking forward to welcoming you at the gallery at another time. Thank you, Chris. It's all yours, Chris.
Oh, it's all mine. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
Sorry, it's only 2 years since I started using Zoom, so you'll have to forgive me.
You're just missing all the introductory clapping.
That's right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me this evening. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm about to talk about a COVID lockdown while I am in COVID lockdown in Sydney. I had hoped to visit Brisbane and do this face to face, but perhaps sometime in the distant future that will be possible. For now, though, what I would like to do is just to talk about what happened last year, and in particular, I think to sort of zoom in on what happened in Wuhan, but also then to zoom out and talk about some of the broader implications of China's experience of COVID since the outbreak and then over the past 18 months. I think journalists always like to think that we're living through historic times, but I think for many of us, it really does feel like the past 18 and more months in particular have been a time of transformation in the world, one of those periods of history when all of the trends happening in the world seem to speed up and crystallize and to take on a particular clarity that that has enduring consequences for all of us. I certainly think that's the case with China. The initial outbreak in Wuhan was a serious crisis for the leadership. Just how serious is something we can talk about. And the Chinese leadership, the Chinese government's capacity to overcome that crisis and to emerge from the COVID pandemic in some ways in better shape than other countries, certainly than other large countries, I think has been a transformative experience for the country, one which has all sorts of longer term consequences politically, economically, and socially. So that's what I'd like to do today, just to, first of all, to begin by zooming in on what happened in Wuhan, what it was like there through those first few months, and how that experience has changed, not just Wuhan, but China more broadly. So if I could just begin remembering how to share my screen here. Sorry, I'm again here showing my. So as Simon was saying in his introductory remarks, I did spend a couple of months in Wuhan last year during the very first lockdown, when it was seemed very much a unique experience, and one that I don't think anybody else in the rest of the world was really think they would be going through at this point, 18 months onward. I went there not too much planning or idea of what to expect. I certainly knew that the COVID outbreak was becoming a more serious problem then. I received an email from editors early that morning saying that we needed to send a journalist to Wuhan because the government had just announced they would be closing down the city. Obviously, the COVID crisis was going to be a big news story for China. And I think I went to Wuhan really with that frame of mind, that this was going to be a serious issue for China, and that this outbreak could last, who knew, 1, 2, 3 weeks. I certainly didn't go there thinking that it would spread so rapidly and so deeply to the rest of the world, and that the experiences of a Wuhan lockdown would be replicated in the rest of the world in big ways and small. So let me just guide you through then what it was like to go through Wuhan in those weeks and days. First of all, arriving in Wuhan on January 23, I think I got in there about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I should say, when I went there, having read the news about Wuhan being locked down, even for China under Xi Jinping, where the Communist Party is so powerful, the idea of locking down a city seemed to be such an extraordinary step, one that hadn't been tried out in China, not even during the SARS pandemic of 2003, when China had already experienced a previous coronavirus outbreak. Even then, the idea of locking down an entire city had not been considered. So when I was going to Wuhan, I guess what I had in mind was, when I arrived at the train station, there would be police everywhere, possibly soldiers, people armed police. Of course, I couldn't even be sure that I'd be allowed off the train. But this is the scene that greeted me in Hankou train station it was on arrival there, it was actually quite empty. And the lines of police and People's Armed Police that I had been expecting there trying to maintain order, I would say there was no more security in the train station than on any normal day in a Chinese city. There certainly weren't the lines of security that I was expecting. Same when I stepped out of the train station as well. So it was quite a puzzling experience for me to begin with. This idea I had that the city would be inundated with security didn't turn out to be the case. Now, that doesn't mean that security wasn't present. It doesn't mean that the People's Armed Police and People's Liberation Army weren't playing a role, but they remained very much in the background. And the reasons for that is something we can talk about going on. If there wasn't much security in the city, though, there was certainly a sense of crisis hanging over people. Even at that point, in the first few days, hospitals were already beginning to become crowded, especially with older people who feared that they had caught the virus and were beginning to inundate hospitals, hoping to get checks for the virus, which back then were very hard, of course, to come by. So going around the hospitals in Wuhan, these were the kinds of scenes that you saw. A lot of anxious faces, people waiting outside, waiting for test results, waiting for their families to get their test results as well. A lot of worry on people's faces. A lot of worry among medical personnel as well. As the rest of the world discovered, in a medical crisis, supplies of protective masks, of protective suits and so on can be in very short supply. And that was certainly the case in Wuhan to begin with. So this was outside one of the larger hospitals in which they'd been receiving these supplies from, I think it was from in Anhui province in China, but they were complaining that they weren't of the right specification that would provide the best protection against a coronavirus. So even when supplies became available, there was a great deal of worry among medical staff that they weren't being adequately protected. At the time, it seemed to be a problem that was very specific to China, but very quickly, of course, the rest of the world caught up with that problem. And then in the days that followed, these were the scenes that you saw in hospitals across Wuhan. I should point out at this point that these photos I was taking were taken through windows from outside these hospitals. Our editors gave us very firm instructions that we weren't to go into hospitals. So with great caution, I did visit hospitals. I did try to take a peek inside at what was happening, but I certainly wasn't going to chance going inside them. So this was taken through the window of one of the larger hospitals, Wuhan United Hospital, one of the larger hospitals there. And as you can see there, people are waiting to get their lung scans back to see if there's any signs that they might have the virus. And in the days that followed, it seemed that the hospitals in Wuhan would have a great deal of trouble coping with the number of people turning up. Again, this is a scene from that hospital. Anxious patients, relatives who had persuaded doctors to let them inside to take care of people. This certainly didn't mean that all of these patients had the coronavirus. At that time, there weren't enough tests available to provide definitive diagnosis in all cases. But of course, this was high flu season in China. So a lot of people, even if they didn't have the virus, turned up at hospitals fearful that they might have it, which in some cases, of course, could turn into another spreading event. So public anger is building in China and certainly in Wuhan through these first weeks of the outbreak, and that really crystallized on February 7, 2020, with the death of Li Wenliang, the doctor whose picture you can see here. He was one of the doctors who was shown an initial report in late 2019 about this mysterious new virus, even before it had a name. And he tried to share the warning with colleagues on a social media group, on a WeChat group, subsequently fell ill. His story really gripped the city and gripped China as well. And so when his death was announced on the early hours of February 7, it really became an enormous public event in China, one in which people focused their anger that their complaints that they hadn't been warned early enough about the presence of this virus in Wuhan, and that people who had tried to warn others, even in private WeChat groups like Dr. Li, had been punished, as he was. As you may remember, he was questioned by police and then warned. So, this was the time when at least some media reports, I'm not sure all of them, were beginning to talk about this moment as a Chernobyl moment in China, one of these moments in public crisis in which the authority of the Chinese Communist Party and its top leader, Xi Jinping, could come into question. I was just thinking about this when I was composing my thoughts for this talk. I guess one of the things about Chernobyl moments is they're not necessarily felt in Chernobyl itself. And by that, I mean, in Wuhan, there was certainly a lot of anger and a lot of frustration. Most of it, I should say, was directed more at local officials. Rightly or wrongly, most people in the city felt that they'd been failed more by provincial and city officials rather than by the central government. And of course, the other factor that came into play in Wuhan is that as angry as people were, there was a sense of crisis in the city. This was the city where the risk of contracting the coronavirus was a day-to-day danger for people. So they'd been told to stay indoors as much as possible. If they did step outside, there was always the risk of contracting the virus. And so therefore I found that when people were stepping outside, their emotions were always a flux of emotions. There was anger, certainly, but there was also a sense of, I think, this resigned sentiment that we've all come to learn in lockdowns, that as angry as you may be with your government and your leaders, you also go along with this request to stay inside as much as possible to get through the crisis. And I did find in Wuhan, it did vary a lot. But among a lot of people, it was really this flux of emotions that you found. Anger at the government, frustration, but also a sense that we have to go along with the rules and just get through this crisis. And so in those weeks through January and February, if you did step outside, this is essentially the scene you would often find on the streets. Very few people going outside. All of the shops are shut, except for supermarkets and food stores for much of the time. And there is a security presence in the city, but not an overwhelming one. What it tends to be is these clusters of police officers and local officials and volunteers who have been dragooned in to ensure that people aren't traveling too far and that they're abiding by the demands that private cars stay off the roads and people stay inside. So what you did tend to find is scenes like this: checkpoints, asking where people are going, checking that people are not trying to get out of the city, and telling people often to go home as well. So what began to change? One thing that you did notice, and I think this is one of the themes I would like to take up from here, is the importance of local party organizations in organizing the response of the city to the coronavirus crisis. So there was a significant police presence. In the first few days in Wuhan, you didn't see too many police. I think, like many residents, they seemed frightened to go outside. But over time, that police presence did begin to rebuild. And in particular, what you did see coming to the fore is these local party organizations, these local neighborhood committees and party organizations, which are very much a presence of urban social fabric and rural social fabric in China, extending the party's power right down to the grassroots, assuming a role in organizing residents, family planning, tax collection, crime prevention, all of these mundane activities. These local organizations play a role, but not one that Chinese people would be thinking of all the time in their lives. But at this time in Wuhan, these party organizations, over a period of weeks, began to organize. And over time, they provided a lot of the organization, the discipline, the oversight, but also the provision of services that got the city through these months. So this is one of these local party organizations that was close to the hotel where I was staying. As you can see, there's a car there, which in theory at least is available to take patients to hospitals. Every day there would be officials who would turn up there, try to deal with residents' needs. Often, for example, older people would have trouble getting access to their medical supplies, their drug prescriptions and food. And it would be these local party organizations that in theory at least would be there to step in and provide that kind of help. The extent to which they could help varied across the city, but certainly in the older areas where there were more established party organizations, they did step up more effectively than other parts of the city. And it's something you began to see across shops as well, much more stringent checks about who was allowed to go in. In the first couple of weeks in the city, was a little bit like more Sydney is now. Most essential services and shops were shut down, but large supermarkets were still open and you could still go and do shopping there. Eventually, they began to discourage people from going to supermarkets. And instead, just to go back, I'll go forward a little bit here. Instead, what you did see is they began to tell people, stay at home, stay in your apartment compound, stay in your homes. We're going to organize food deliveries for you. This is what you began to see as well. These local officials would turn up and buy sacks full of potatoes and cabbages and other goods for people. And people could order things online as well. But for a lot of people, their diet for a few weeks there was provided by these supplies that were directed through their local neighborhood organizations. A lot of complaints about having to eat cabbage and instant noodles every day. But the city, the government was determined to force people to stay inside except in emergencies. And that's as far as they went. So party organization begins to step in. And of course, that is at the national level as well. And so right down from Xi Jinping downward, there is this mobilization of resources for Wuhan. And what you see here is part of the mobilization to build one of the hospitals that was set up in a period of 2 weeks to take in coronavirus patients. And as you can see there, there's these trucks that are being brought in right across the province to build this hospital. I think in the end, they said 10 days. It wasn't completely finished by then, but they had something up and running. And the lockdown becomes more and more effective. By mid-February, the streets are pretty much empty. This is the most busy bridge in Wuhan, which is transected by the Yangtze River. As you can see there, by mid-February, very few cars on the roads. Most of those cars are being driven by officials, medical doctors, and people like that. Virtually no civilians are allowed onto the streets. And supplies are coming in from the rest of the country as well. So part of this mobilization means that doctors are being asked to volunteer to come to Wuhan, and also material supplies are being trucked into the city as well. Initially, there were some reports of severe shortages in Wuhan. That may well have been the case, certainly in outlying districts of the city, but within a few weeks, supplies were coming in from the rest of the country. And I think people in Wuhan were doing it pretty hard, that's for sure. But general levels of supplies meant that most people were able to get some food every day, even if it wasn't the meals that they would have liked. And stringent checks on neighborhoods as well. This is earlier on, but to go in and out of your compound required certificates, cajoling local officials to let you out. And so what you did see over this period of weeks is that Wuhan, this city of 11 million people, becomes honeycombed into these very isolated units of apartment blocks in which people essentially can't leave at all. Eventually, of course, it did manage to suppress the virus, but it was a very hard time for residents of the city, especially if they had family members who fell ill or even died from the virus. Walking through the city through those weeks, you would come across people like this man who had sneaked outside just to get some fresh air and get away from his family for a little while. And you can see from the expression on his face that he's doing it pretty tough. And a lot of people had expressions on their faces like that at the time. Eventually, though, what you did see over those weeks is these extremely stringent measures across the city began to suppress the virus. What you see here is a shot I took from a Chinese medical paper, just showing the spread of the virus right through to early February. So by early February in Wuhan, a lot of the city, a lot of neighborhoods there are reporting cases of the virus. And it did look a very dangerous period for the city if the spread of the virus was allowed to continue like that. Instead, what we did see is this. And what you see here is another screenshot from another study showing how travel across the city began to slow. The first shot you see there is December 2019, showing patterns of travel across the city at a very busy time. January 17, right before the shutdown of the city, it's still quite busy, starting to slow down a little bit, partly because people are leaving for the Lunar New Year holiday, right up to January 21. But then we move to January 26, a few days after the lockdown, and you can see that travel across the city is really suppressed very quickly. Now, people are still moving around their neighborhoods, but much more restricted than before. But they're not commuting from one side of Wuhan to the other for work or anything like that. And so, over those few weeks, going into February and April, the city really does come to a standstill. For several weeks out there, I was lucky enough in my hotel to be allowed occasionally just for fresh air, or to go to a bank and try to send my family some money through the bank teller, things like that. I could go outside, but essentially I was walking into a ghost city. By early April, the city is starting to turn back to life. And this is the Yangtze River, early April, a few boats on the river, not too many. Old neighborhoods of the city are still locked down like this. And eventually people are starting to be allowed out again, like this man who going for his swim in the Yangtze River, which is quite a terrifying thing. That river really does flow quickly. You don't see it from a distance, but it really does flow fast. So eventually the leadership feels that it's getting on top of the problem. Xi Jinping is absent from Chinese official media for a couple of weeks there. He then begins to make appearances. He doesn't go to Wuhan until this scene in March 10, I believe it is. And he's visiting one of the hospitals there, beginning to feel at last that the government is getting on top of the problem. And he visits a hospital, but doesn't dare, of course, visit any patients or doctors face to face. So he says hello to them over a video screen. Eventually, though, victory is declared. What we see here is Xi Jinping in September last year giving awards to some of the medical personnel who the party praises for their key role in victory over the pandemic. One of those, of course, standing to Xi Jinping's left is Zhong Nanshan, one of the doctors who helped to speak out earlier about the risk that this virus is spreading through human-to-human contact. And this is Xi Jinping in July this year, giving the July 1 speech for the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party. So early last year, I'll step off from the screen now. I'll stop sharing. So certainly in early last year, I wouldn't say that the Communist Party was in danger of losing power or anything like that, but certainly its authority was in question. In those early weeks of the spread of the virus, as I said, there was a great deal of anger, consternation across the country, particularly directed at local officials, but also questions about why the central government didn't act sooner to warn people that this virus was spreading human to human. Questions about when the central government knew that there was human to human spread and why they didn't share that information sooner. There was a period of significant crisis for the leadership. But by that last slide, which I showed of July 1 this year, you can see that there's a very different mood in the country. And just to conclude my remarks now, I think that mood is one that's going to continue and have consequences for some time to come. What you do see in China now, certainly from the leadership, and to some extent going into society as well, is a sense of vindication, a belief that China's experience in pushing back against the coronavirus much more effectively and well before any other large countries, such as the United States, such as countries in Western Europe, such as Russia and India, is a vindication for China's fundamental model of governance, a model of governance, of course, in which the Chinese Communist Party is very central. And what you do see now is, I think, a sense from the leadership that at a time when it had come under challenge, it has proven to itself, to its population, and to the rest of the world that this model of governance of one-party rule, of an authoritarian government that can provide mobilization of resources, concentration of resources, and draconian controls over its own population is one that serves China well. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't dissenting voices in China, or that there aren't crises that throw into question those lessons, but I do think it's a message that the leadership has embraced, and also a significant part of the population as well. So just to end up my comments here, I do think we have entered a time now where the party leadership under Xi Jinping feels confident that whatever challenges may be thrown at China now, whatever domestic challenges may emerge for the leadership, such as the terrible floods in central China in the past few days, that China has the model, has an authoritarian system of government which is going to carry it through. So that doesn't mean that China's future is now set in stone. It doesn't mean that that model of governance is not going to come under challenge. But I do think there is a sense now that any sense that the party leadership is going to face immediate crisis or challenge or even overthrow, I think that is something that is not in prospect for some time now, unless there's a fundamental change in China, and that doesn't seem to be in prospect. So I see I've spoken for too long, so I wouldn't do, but how about we turn over to questions now? We can talk more about what happened in Wuhan, but those broader lessons as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris. That's just been absolutely fascinating. And, it was so interesting. We talked about whether or not you might show photos, and I've got to say it was absolutely captivating. A reminder for many of us that have visited China, a glimpse, I guess, in some ways of the human dimension of the impact of COVID that has been a little bit lost, but also that scale of mobilization and the kind of control that can come to the fore. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Caitlin Byrne. I'm the director of the Griffith Asia Institute. We're really delighted that firstly, Chris is here with us and able to talk to his experience in Wuhan. I'm also really delighted to see so many of you on the line. And Chris, I can say there are a few names that you'll recognise in our participant list as well. So I know you've got a bit of a following around Australia. And again, we're just so delighted to hear from you. I was going to have a couple of questions prepared to get our audience warmed up, but I think they're warmed up already. So we might actually start with those questions, and please feel free to those of you in the audience to keep them coming. If you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and they will come to me and I can read them out to Chris. I'm going to start with one that comes from Jason Young, and it really relates to that issue of control, I guess. And Jason is also very thankful to you for sharing your insights. He was particularly fascinated by your discussion of the neighbourhood groups and the local party organisations in Wuhan. So his question is, was this autonomous or was it more top-down? And why the party and not the government?
Okay, I'll try to keep my answers as quick as possible and speak quickly. So a very good question, Jason, and I'm not going to present myself as an expert on local party committees in China, but I do think it was certainly top down, but there was a sort of a grassroots element as well. What you did see in Wuhan, and this was replicated across China, is that the central government and the local governments told local party committees to mobilize. Now, initially, of course, getting people to mobilize wasn't that easy, even in China. A lot of people are scared. Local party committees often are staffed by, I wouldn't say amateurs, but part-time officials, older people who don't necessarily know how to organize things like this. But what you did see in Wuhan and elsewhere is that the local governments then began to say, okay, we're going to assign local officials from the city government, from county government to come down and help you to get organized as well. So there was this process of augmentation when local groups at the neighborhood level and at the district level were being supported, in the case of Wuhan, by Wuhan city officials who were being sent down to get things organized. So that was part of what was happening here, very much a top-down process. I do think it did work in part because there was a sort of a grassroots effect as well. And by that I mean, if it was simply a coercive effort, if it was simply officials who were threatening people that they had to stay inside, I don't think it would have been quite as effective. What you did hear from people in Wuhan is, I did make some friends there, and they'd say, well, can you come outside today for a walk? Can you sneak past your local officials and come outside and we'll sort of maintain social distance and just go for a walk and just clear our heads? And they would say, like, I'm sorry, I can't go out today. The local official I know, who is a family friend, he's not on duty today, so he won't let me out. So what you did see is that sort of these local officials would often know the people they were trying to control. And so that gave them a little bit of latitude sometimes to do favors for some people, but it did mean that they did know who was around, who was supposed to be around, and it sort of gave them that sort of social capital to exercise a bit more influence over people and say, you've got to stay inside. Mm-hmm. So I do think it was very much a top-down effort, but I think that sort of grassroots effect did have it did play a role certainly in Wuhan and probably in other parts of China as well.
Just quickly, was that same level of mobilization that you saw in Wuhan replicated? This is a question from Tess Newton-Kane. That, and you've indicated this, was that replicated across China more generally?
It generally was, and I should say at this point that it wasn't always a benign effort either. You know, you did see those reports from different parts of China last year about people sort of being welled in inside their apartments, quite brutal actions by local officials as well, some serious cases of elderly people being neglected after being told to stay inside. By and large, though, what you did see is, in different ways, with slightly different models across China, is that local party effort kicking in. And, you know, after I left Wuhan and then was escorted back to Beijing for a couple more weeks of quarantine, it was very much through, not entirely through local officials, but certainly through district level officials who'd been more or less signed up for the job and weren't always happy about it, but weren't going to run away from the job either.
Now, I also have a question from Professor Colin McKerris, who's one of our very esteemed members at Griffith Asia Institute. And Colin, it's great to have you on the line or in the audience. Thanks for joining us tonight. So his question is this, and there's a bit of background to read first. Do you think the reason the local party and government were at first very reluctant to admit how serious this outbreak was? It's obvious to us now, of course, but it might not have been obvious to them then. Also, I'm getting a little message that my internet connection is unstable. Hopefully it's sticking with you. But also, he says they would have been desperate not to do anything drastic because people were preparing to travel during the Spring Festival holiday. You did mention it in your talk, but I wonder if it might not have loomed larger to local party officials than it does to us. Maybe the central authorities were kept in the dark, as many have suggested, but not from evil motives, but because this was their actual situation. What are your thoughts on this?
The whole question about what the Chinese government knew in those first weeks and months and what different layers of government knew is a very complicated one. And I can only give a very truncated answer here. I do think it is the case that pretty early on, certainly by late December, early January, senior officials in Wuhan and also medical officials in Beijing understood that there was a new coronavirus that had emerged in the city. And a coronavirus is not something that passes among human beings that often. So it certainly did raise alarm bells among medical experts, and they knew it was a serious thing. Just how serious, of course, not everybody took in at the time. And I think in particular at that time, you know, coronaviruses, I'm not going to be an expert on these things, but of course they can vary in the extent of transmissibility as well. And one of the other things that we didn't quite realize then is the extent to which this particular coronavirus could be carried through asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic cases as well. So given that, I think Professor McKerris is right that, you know, it's not right to say that the Chinese government and Chinese officials knew everything about this virus from the beginning and hid it. Nonetheless, there is this period, particularly in January, in which there is certainly in Wuhan hospitals a great deal of evidence emerging of human-to-human transmission. Doctors, presidents of hospitals in Wuhan are trying to warn officials there that this is serious. They're seeing human-to-human transmission. They're seeing colleagues fall ill through the virus, which is certainly a clear sign of human-to-human transmission. But for a couple of weeks there, these signs aren't being acted on. Now, exactly why, I think, is something that historians and political scientists are going to ruminate on for a long time. But I think it probably does come down to a sort of combination of complacency about levels of transmissibility, a desire not to mess up the Chinese Lunar New Year holidays and also the political calendar. with the meetings of the party congresses at that time as well. And just this sense as well that we've had avian virus flus come through the city, but they've never quite taken off. So why do we have to, expend so much time and attention on dealing with this as well? I think there was that sort of complacency that slowed the response as well. So a simplified answer to a very complicated question. I do think that there was knowledge appearing, crystallizing in that period, and exactly why they didn't act, I think, is something that we're all going to be asking ourselves for a long time to come.
Mm. And it's interesting with hindsight, the answers we might come up with may not reflect what was happening at the time as well. Now, the next question comes from Ian Hall, the Deputy Director here at GAI, who is asking about that sense of vulnerability you mentioned that the party had at the height of the crisis in Wuhan. How lasting do you think that sense of vulnerability might be? And do you think the leadership was rattled in a lasting way by that sense of public anger?
Yeah, another very good question I'll try to give brief answers to. Sorry, please remind me of the first question again. I was just trying. This sense of vulnerability.
How lasting do you think that might be?
Well, this sense of vulnerability on the part of the Communist Party leadership is not something that simply emerged from COVID. If you read Xi Jinping's speeches and previous leaders as well, there's always this combination of both confidence that the Communist Party has the wherewithal to deal with crisis, but also this sense that that particular crisis or another crisis could be just around the corner. So often their speeches are this, they're telling officials to be, confident that the party has the wherewithal, but also warning them to be wary against risks. And COVID has certainly reinforced that sentiment within the party. I think in particular what it has done under Xi Jinping is reinforce a sense that sometimes the weakest links in governance in China are at the local level. And insofar as there can be problems that turn into bigger problems that can turn into crises, it tends to be these neglected corners of local government in China, public health, transport, food safety, and so on. So I think that sense of vulnerability at the grassroots is one that the leadership is trying to respond to in different ways now. I forget the precise date, but we've certainly seen any number of regulations come out from the central leadership, including most recently about strengthening grassroots governance across China. And I think that is one area where we're going to see, China bringing to bear not just party organization, but also the new resources of high technology, big data collection, monitoring of citizens' behavior in order to plug those gaps in the system as well.
And actually that feeds really nicely into the next question, which comes from Sue Travaskis, who asked, can you give us your take on how surveillance technology used during this time, first in Wuhan and then everywhere in China, has actually changed the governance landscape?
At this point, I should add a footnote that I have been out of China for almost a year now. So I will hedge my answer a little bit because things change quickly in China and technology can change quickly as well. So with that asterisk, let me just say that I think technology does play a role in China, perhaps more quickly, certainly than Australia. People got used to using these scan codes on your phones and things like that to go in and out of places. And that became very, very much a part of China's response to COVID. That said, I do sometimes just want to add a little note of caution that we shouldn't overestimate the extent to which China's technological surveillance system is all-seeing and all-powerful. It's certainly very powerful. It can certainly reach into people's lives, but sometimes there can be flaws in the system, duplication, technologies that don't mesh together, problems like that. People can have a scan code on their phone, but they can also have several different phones. So it's possible to sneak in and out of different places where they shouldn't be. So that's a way of saying that I think that grassroots governance in China, party organization, that more human element of control, of management of populations also remains very important in China. Xi Jinping calls these efforts a people's war. And by describing it as a people's war, it's not just a mobilization of technologies, it's a mobilization of people as well. And the two things are supposed to combine together in forms of government that don't necessarily replicate in other societies. So I think Sue does make a very good point that these technologies are going to become more and more important, more sophisticated. But I think they're always going to be, or for a long time, they will always be enmeshed with these forms of local government in China that can seem quite old-fashioned to outsiders.
I want to pick up on a point you made actually quite early when you said, the irony of presenting while you're in lockdown in Sydney about the Wuhan lockdown is not lost on you. I think it's also interesting to note that we're having this discussion while the Olympics are being launched in Tokyo, again in a crisis state because of the virus. How important, so China will be hosting the Winter Olympics in 2 years' time. How important is that event going to be as a demonstration to the rest of the world about China's leadership and that kind of vindication of having dealt with the virus, assuming that things stay much as they are?
Yes, it's certainly going to be one of those signal public events for China and also for the Chinese leadership, leading, of course, into the Party Congress later in the year when Xi Jinping, to judge from all the signs, will be taking another 5 years in power. That said, I think the Chinese government will be looking very closely at, first of all, at how the Tokyo Olympics go, and also at just how vaccination and suppression of the virus performs across the world in the next couple of years. I don't think there's any confidence yet, for example, that China is going to declare open house for its particular Winter Olympics and going to be letting the world in again. Apart from all sorts of security issues, I do think there is that underlying worry that this virus, is a very pernicious one, that its variants can still evolve. And therefore, although I'm sure the Chinese government wants it to be a period of, a time of triumph and confidence, there is still going to be that edge of anxiety about the virus. And exactly how much anxiety there is, I think, is really going to hang on how these Tokyo Olympics goes and how the world fares in the next couple of years.
And you mentioned the National Congress of the CCP taking place as well. And that is going to be interesting. You've really reported on the inner workings of the Communist Party for a number of years, and you're very well known for that. What are the signals that we should be looking for in terms of the future of China's leadership and indeed whether there is succession planning underway?
Well, reporting on Chinese elite politics is a very humbling game at the moment because China's become, more secretive than ever. So even more so than in the past, it's become very difficult to pronounce confidently about what the Chinese leadership is thinking and planning, certainly from the outside and certainly from Sydney. That said, I think, Chinese state media, party media, propaganda does give us some clues, as do personnel moves. And I think all of those clues do point to the fact that Xi Jinping appears confident and resolved on remaining in power for the time being. And that certainly means, I think, another 5 years as Communist Party General Secretary and then the state president from 2023 as well. That said, this whole question about whether there's going to be a potential successor at the next party congress, whether Xi Jinping is going to anoint an heir apparent or potential heirs apparent, that's going to be a guessing game that occupies us for the next 1.5 years. The signs are at the moment that if I was forced to guess, I would be surprised if a particular individual emerges as Xi Jinping's successor next year. I think it's going to be a much more complicated and drawn out process. If I have egg on my face at the Party Congress next year, please erase this video and we'll forget my prediction.
Or we'll invite you back to talk about what is happening.
Yes.
I would like to pick up on your career and what the future holds. But before we do that, we've got a question from Ximena. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Asking, what is your take on the possibility that the origin of COVID-19 was some sort of accidental laboratory leak? And I think here the sensitivity that we've seen from China about the questions about the origin of the virus plays into that. The lab leak theory was disregarded by international experts though, but is now gaining a bit more traction in discussion. Would love to hear from you on that.
Okay, let me quickly break my answer into two parts. First of all, the whole question about the origin of the virus is one I think best left for scientists. You know, as journalists, I think what we can do is try to responsibly report on what the science is pointing to, what the problems are and challenges are, both scientific and political, and in arriving at a conclusion. You know, that's all I'd say on that. I do think that it does seem that the prevalence of scientific opinion, not necessarily always reflected in the media, is still that the virus probably spread from natural reservoirs without going through the lab. But let's just let the scientists arrive at their conclusions about that. And that leads me to the second part of the question of my answer, which is, you know, and this partly has a bearing on Professor Macaris's early question. You know, this question about how the virus spread, whether it could have been stopped earlier, whether there were mistakes in those early weeks and months, is one which is going to be extremely sensitive for the Chinese leadership, in a sense, irrespective of where the virus actually came from. So in other words, even if the natural spillover theory is the most plausible one and turns out to be right, I think because it's become entangled with all of these questions about political responsibility and who knew what, and who should have known what. Even so, the leadership, the Chinese government as a whole, is very sensitive about these issues. And so sometimes that sensitivity can be read by people as being sort of de facto proof that it must have come from a lab or something like that. I think at the very least, the political response is much more complicated than that. Doesn't necessarily reflect a sort of a conviction that it came from a lab, or at least we have to be open to other possibilities as well. Just before this call, I did spend part of my day covering a press conference in Beijing at which precisely these issues came up again. And you know, the Chinese government officials were very set against this idea of revisiting the lab leak theory. They were essentially saying that the WHO has said what it should be say already on that point, and they don't want the WHO investigators to sort of go back and revisit the lab theory. So it remains a very contentious one for China, very contentious issue, this whole question of the role of the labs. All I would say again is let the science do its work, but don't necessarily read that sensitivity as being sort of, overwhelming circumstantial evidence that it must have come from a lab or something like that. I think it's a very complicated scientific issue that would could take some time to answer, even in the best conditions when the Chinese government wasn't so sensitive about sharing evidence.
And I guess a somewhat of a follow-on to that, how important then has the role of China's vaccine diplomacy, you know, its ability to develop and distribute vaccines around the world, especially in our part of the world or in the Southeast Asia, how important has that been to China rebuilding its own reputation around the world?
Again, I'm stepping beyond my normal boundaries of expertise just to offer some general observations. I think it has been very important for China, certainly in those areas of poorer parts of the world, the developing world, which simply haven't had access to other vaccines. And so therefore, whatever problems of efficacy, there may be problem with the vaccines. It does seem that in other parts of the world, certainly earlier on, when people are so desperate for any form of protection from the virus, it's been a very important way for China to try to rebuild trust and some goodwill with other parts of the world. That said, the continuing problems with the levels of efficacy of the Chinese vaccines, I think, is a continuing problem for them, and one that does blunt some of the effectiveness of that public diplomacy.
I know I've been stretching the bounds of time with these questions. Just one more question, and actually it relates to one that was posed very early on by Peter Ambrose. You have been reporting, you've been a China correspondent based in China for a number of years, and you've been outside China for the last, what did you say, 18 months, 12 months? What does the future hold for you? Do you see yourself getting back to China? And what does the media landscape look like in China?
Well, just as a little bit of background here, visas in general for China have become much more difficult because of COVID. China is still largely shut down to most foreign nationals. And on top of that, there have, of course, been continued tensions over foreign journalists in China. In particular, it should be said with, the Australian media, but also with American newspapers as well. So in March last year, there was expulsions of journalists from a number of American newspapers, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. I wasn't actually caught up in those official expulsions, but I did have to leave China. It should be said, those tensions between foreign media and the Chinese government have not entirely gone away. I always loved reporting in China. There's, I spent most of my career there. It's much more than a job to me. So I certainly do hope to go back there. Exactly when, I don't know, but in COVID times, we all live to live in hope.
Indeed. Chris, look, thank you. It's just been fabulous to hear from you, and thank you for sharing those images that you've taken. I think that really just gave us a glimpse of that human dimension again, I think that we've possibly missed over the last several months. I'm quoting from the Griffith Asia Institute, one of our industry fellows, a friend of yours, Rowan Kallick, also a former China correspondent, who describes you as the New York Times most distinguished China correspondent, and noted in an article he wrote earlier this year that over the last 15 years, you've broken more scoops about and produced more credible analyses of events in the People's Republic than any journalist in the world. I think hearing from you tonight has reminded us just how important the role that you have played and continue to play, how important that is for us in understanding a rising China, understanding China into the future. It's terribly sad we don't have correspondents on the ground, and for Australia, I think that's a huge issue for us going forward. But we're really delighted you were here. We will bring you to Brisbane. I know it's been a couple of decades since you've been here. I suspect it's changed a little bit since you were last here. And I know Simon, Tarun, and the rest of the team at the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art would love to have the chance to chat with you and show you through the gallery as well. We will welcome you back. But Chris, thank you so much. It's just been a delight to hear from you tonight.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thanks to all our audience. We look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, Simon. Thanks, Tarun. Thanks, Megan, and the rest of the Griffith Asia Institute team.
Thank you.
Thanks,
everyone.
Caitlin. Bye.